The text arrived at 8:43 p.m. 4 words: I need a break. No contact. I read it twice, then a third time, to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting. Emily, my girlfriend of 3 years, had just decided to cut off all communication with me. No explanation, no timeline, nothing. Just a direct, final statement that shifted all control to her. I put my phone down and considered my options. Panic would be useless. Anger was predictable but ineffective. The only useful response was measured observation. I noted her phrasing carefully. I need a break to figure myself out. Entirely self-focused, with no acknowledgement of any relational consequences. The no-contact clause eliminated any possibility of dialogue, placing the entire narrative in her hands. I paced around my apartment, looking out the window at the street below. Everything outside continued normally, indifferent to the disruption in my personal life. I catalogued this detail mentally. The world remained logical. The variable that had changed was our relationship. I reviewed our interactions over the past few months for any warning signs. There were none. No escalating arguments, no complaints, no expressions of dissatisfaction. Everything appeared routine, consistent. And yet, with one message, the stability we had built crumbled. The next morning introduced a new variable. Emily had been tagged in a post by her mother on social media. Public exposure. Anyone paying attention could now see the situation. This created a new layer of complexity. A private matter was now influenced by external forces, adding social pressure. I had no way of knowing whether Emily had requested this, or if her mother acted independently. But the effect was the same. We no longer controlled our own narrative. Emotionally, the optimal response was non-reaction. I catalogued my internal state: mild anxiety, moderate disappointment, a slight sense of betrayal. Each measurable, each noted. Maintaining composure was essential. Any impulsive reaction could be reframed as overreaction, weakening my position if communication resumed. From a strategic perspective, the situation had 3 key factors. First, Emily had unilaterally imposed a communication freeze. Second, her mother had inserted herself publicly. Third, no explanation or negotiation existed. This required patience, observation, and a controlled response. The first step was to remain calm, followed by sending a carefully worded message, designed to gather information without compromising my position. I drafted a concise text. Understood. Let me know when you're ready to talk. I respect your need for space. No emotion, no pleading, no guilt-tripping. The message achieved 3 objectives. It acknowledged her terms, maintained my composure, and preserved the possibility for structured discussion later. I mentally outlined potential scenarios. Scenario 1. Emily contacts me after a set period to explain. Scenario 2. She continues silence, in which case the relationship may need reassessment. Scenario 3. Her mother continues public interference, complicating perception and dynamics. Each scenario demanded a distinct response, and I needed to be prepared for all outcomes. I leaned back, analyzing the situation. The most important variable was information: why she initiated the break, whether it was temporary, and how much influence her mother would continue to exert. Other emotional responses were secondary and irrelevant to decision-making in this phase. In summary, Emily imposed isolation. Her mother complicated the environment. My task was observation, patience, and calculated action. Everything else was irrelevant at this stage. I logged, observed, and planned. Every next step would have to be deliberate. In this situation, emotion offered no advantage. Emily and I had been together for 3 years. We met in college. 2 introverts bonded over late-night coffee runs and obscure playlists. What started as casual companionship gradually became central to both our lives. Routines, synced habits aligned, and a predictable sense of comfort emerged. That very comfort is what made her sudden break so disorienting. We had discussed the future countless times moving in together. Career goals, vacations, weekend routines, even marriage. Everything seemed linear, logical, mutually agreed upon. In hindsight, it was a blueprint for stability, but no blueprint can fully control human behavior. The change started subtly. Messages occasionally delayed, conversations sometimes distracted, little excuses appearing more often. I catalogued each detail but initially assigned minimal weight. When aggregated, a pattern of distance emerged, signaling a potential problem. Emily's independence was always defining. She preferred managing her own schedule, handling her own emotions, rarely asking for help. But independence is a spectrum. And recently she had crossed a threshold. Distance had become noticeable, measurable, and opaque. What was once predictable had grown uncertain. Family influence added complexity. Emily's mother had always been protective, sometimes intrusive. Now, by tagging Emily publicly on social media, private matters became exposed. Introducing new variables outside my control, I focused on deliberate observation. I monitored social media activity, post frequency, and interactions. I avoided direct engagement beyond the initial message, maximizing situational awareness while respecting her imposed break. Emotions were catalogued, not acted upon for strategic analysis. I constructed potential scenarios. Emily returns with explanations. She remains silent, or her mother intervenes further. Each required a different response. Scripts were mentally prepared. If she returned, I would acknowledge her autonomy while re-establishing boundaries. If she remained absent, I would focus on energy and emotional management. External perception was also considered. Friends and acquaintances had limited data. Emily's activity, her mother's posts, and my silence. Maintaining composure publicly while observing privately was crucial. One misstep could alter perceived credibility, indirectly affecting outcomes by the end of the second week. I had built a matrix of influencing factors: Emily's personal needs, her unilateral break, maternal involvement, public exposure, and my own response capacity. Each factor could shift independently, and each required careful monitoring before action. The relationship was no longer just 2 people. It had become a complex system, yet the foundation built over 3 years remained valid. Her personality, thought patterns, and habits all could serve as predictive indicators if analyzed correctly. The break, disruptive as it was simply a new variable. Strategic observation, patience, and controlled communication would determine the ultimate outcome. 2 weeks had passed, and everything remained silent. Emily didn't message, didn't call, and left almost no direct signs. Only occasional posts from her mother indicated one thing: the situation was no longer just a private matter between the 2 of us, had become a public variable, indirectly observed by others. Every small movement, every post or like could ripple through the social environment, affecting perception, behavior, and the subtle balance between us. I spent most of my time observing, not waiting passively. but actively analyzing and understanding. Every interaction, no matter how minor, was catalogued. A like, a comment, a seemingly random hashtag. These were not trivial. They were data points, each carrying potential insight into Emily's mindset, her mother's involvement, or social dynamics that could influence the situation. I began classifying them by significance. What reflected Emily's mood? What reflected her mother's interference? And what reflected ordinary social media habits? Each category became part of a larger map, a framework for predicting possible outcomes. Another dimension of observation was my own behavior. Each surge of frustration or disappointment was noted and placed within a strategic context. I did not act on these impulses. I realized that in this environment, emotional reactions would only forfeit control. Control was my only leverage. Maintaining it meant observing carefully, recording patterns, and deciding the exact timing and nature of any action. During these days, I revisited past conversations with Emily, not to dwell on memories, but to detect predictable behavioral patterns, triggers, and subtle cues I might have missed. One observation stood out: under stress, Emily rarely changed her behavior if she felt that control was preserved on her side. This meant that if I remained calm, patient, and deliberate, the chances of her returning with explanations or attempts to reconcile were higher. Impulsiveness, on the other hand, could push her further away or create chaos in the delicate dynamic. Her mother's increasing public presence added another layer of complexity. Every post, comment, or story was like subtle surveillance, a variable I had to factor into every decision. While I did not fear her influence, I understood that mishandling the situation could distort outside perception of our relationship and indirectly influence Emily's choices. This realization required me to think not just in binary terms, contact or no contact, but as a network of variables interacting simultaneously, each requiring careful analysis. I also planned potential scenarios meticulously. If Emily returned with explanations, I would need to establish clear boundaries while acknowledging her personal needs. If she remained silent, I would focus on energy management, keeping distance to protect myself while monitoring behavioral trends. If her mother continued interference, I would incorporate these signals into my decisions, responding deliberately without letting emotions dictate my actions. Each possibility had contingencies, and each contingency had sub-contingencies, because in this system, minor details could cascade into significant outcomes. During this time, I maintained a strict routine. Work, exercise, meals, and daily habits were meticulously scheduled. This structure was not a distraction from Emily, but a means to preserve mental stability and energy control. Calmness allowed better decision-making, and I knew that this strategic patience was far more important than any fleeting emotional impulse. My mind needed to remain clear, my responses calculated, and my internal state unshakable. At night, I would sit alone, reviewing and cataloguing everything: Emily's actions and habits, her mother's subtle interventions, small signals from social media, and my own internal reactions. Everything was analyzed, ranked by importance, and stored as a foundation for subsequent decisions. Patterns emerged: timing, phrasing, social context, and interaction style all painted a nuanced picture that could guide future actions. By the end of part 3, one realization was unmistakable: everything remained under control if I maintained strategy, patience, and focused observation instead of emotional reaction. Emily's break wasn't an ending, It was simply a new variable in a complex, multi-layered system I needed to analyze, predict, and manage. It was a test of endurance, foresight, and self-discipline, where every small choice could either maintain stability or tip the system into chaos. The quiet was not emptiness. It was data. The pause was not surrender. It was leverage. And I understood, clearly, that the next move would require precision, calm, and unwavering control, because in this situation, control was everything. The third week began, and Emily's silence persisted, but the atmosphere around us had grown tenser than ever. This was no longer just a relationship between two people. External social factors had entered the picture. Her mother started posting indirect messages, sometimes vague reminders, allowing friends and acquaintances to interpret the situation in ways I couldn't control. Every post, every comment, felt like invisible darts, creating pressure on both Emily and me. Everything had become a strategic game I had to navigate. I realized that in this environment, any impulsive action could be misinterpreted, and every emotional reaction could forfeit control. I began building an observation log. Likes, comments, posts, and subtle signals were all catalogued, classified into 3 categories: direct signals from Emily, influence from her mother, and normal social media habits. Every detail, no matter how small, became data for analysis. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I noticed Emily posted a photo with a vague caption suggesting she was self-reflecting. It wasn't directed at me, but I understood the message. She was in a process of self-assessment, and the distance she created wasn't just a pause, it was a strategic challenge. I didn't react immediately. Instead, I analyzed every detail: the angle of the photo, her gaze, expressions, the caption itself, comparing it to previous data to gauge mood and behavioral changes. Meanwhile, her mother continued her interventions, posting indirect messages and commenting on mutual friends' posts, spreading information faster than anticipated. Some mutual friends asked me about the situation, but I responded briefly and neutrally, without letting emotion dictate my words. Every statement was deliberate. It reflected me and indirectly influenced how Emily perceived me. One small mistake could erode the calm, controlled image I had established. I began preparing more detailed response scenarios. If Emily returned wanting to explain, I would set clear boundaries, acknowledge her autonomy, but not accept repeated disruptive behavior. If she remained silent, I would maintain distance to protect myself while continuing to collect data on her behavior and her mother's influence. And if her mother escalated interventions, I would use the observed data to respond strategically, keeping emotions in check. Another key realization: emotional control could become an advantage. Staying calm amid chaos, resisting impulsive reactions, allowed me to maintain analytical clarity and make timely decisions. Every action, no matter how small, had to be weighed within a long-term strategic perspective. I began noting potential critical signals: posting frequency, indirect content, mutual friends' reactions, and any changes in Emily's daily routines. By the end of the week, one thing was clear: the conflict wasn't only coming from Emily, but from the surrounding environment. Her mother, social media, and outside observers added layers of pressure. I had to maintain absolute control, observe carefully, and prepare for every possible variable. Emily's break was no longer a private matter. It had become a strategic challenge. How I responded would determine the next outcome. not only for the relationship, but also for my personal energy and emotional balance. By the 4th week, the dynamics had subtly shifted. Emily remained silent in direct communication, but indirect signals were becoming increasingly pronounced. Photos she posted, the captions she chose, and even her interactions with mutual friends suggested she was struggling. Internally torn between asserting her independence and dealing with an underlying sense of guilt, I realized that this phase was critical. Every move I made now had the potential to shape the trajectory of our relationship. One evening, she posted a long, nuanced status. It wasn't directed at me, yet it carried undertones of both acknowledgement and unspoken questions, as if she were testing the waters without wanting to confront directly. I did not rush to respond. Instead, I read it carefully, noting the choice of words, her phrasing, and subtle emotional cues. I compared them to patterns I had observed before, analyzing for consistency, change, and possible intentions. Each detail, the tone, structure, timing, and even emojis or punctuation became critical data points. Meanwhile, her mother's subtle interventions continued. She would comment or post in ways that applied indirect pressure on both Emily and me, and I understood that these external influences were now integral to the strategy. Maintaining control meant not only observing Emily, but also predicting how these external forces could sway her behavior. I kept my own actions neutral. No posts, no comments, no visible reactions, preserving an image of calm and composed authority. That night, I compiled everything I had observed over the past weeks. Each action, each gesture, each indirect message was mapped into potential scenarios. Emily returning to explain, remaining silent, or her mother escalating her interventions. For each, I drafted strategic responses: how to communicate, how to establish boundaries, how to manage energy and emotions, and how to respond to outside influences without compromising control. In this process, I realized the true nature of the challenge. The tension was not in her words, but in the uncertainty, the waiting, and the strategic space created by her silence. Every reaction I had didn't have affected the momentum. Maintaining patience and calmness allowed me to assess the situation with clarity, keeping options open while letting Emily navigate her own decisions. I also became acutely aware of the psychological stakes. The break she had taken was testing not just her self-perception, but my capacity to remain measured, disciplined, and strategic. Emotional impulses could sabotage the careful balance I had been maintaining. Every thought, every intention, had to be filtered through the lens of long-term outcomes rather than immediate gratification. By the end of this period, the scenario had evolved into a complex interplay of observation, anticipation, and restraint. The challenge was no longer just about Emily. It involved managing a network of influences: her mother, social perception, and mutual friends, while keeping my own energy and focus intact. This phase marked the true turning point, a test of endurance, strategic patience, and the ability to respond effectively in a high-stakes, emotionally charged environment. The 5th week began, and the tension around me had reached its peak. Emily still hadn't contacted me directly, but indirect signals appeared more frequently and with greater subtlety. Every photo, every status update, and the way she interacted with mutual friends revealed internal conflict. She wanted independence, but also sought understanding and connection. I realized immediately that this was the turning point. Every action, even inaction, could directly affect the relationship and my personal energy. One evening, I noticed her posting a long, profound status that reflected self-examination and doubt. It wasn't directed at me, but the message was clear. She was testing both herself and me. I didn't message or comment. Instead, I analyzed every detail: her phrasing, word choice, sentence structure, timing of the post, and even her interactions with mutual friends. Every detail became critical data to predict her next move and true intentions. Emily's mother continued her indirect interventions, but I began recognizing a pattern. She used subtle tactics to create pressure and guilt, while testing my composure and strategic thinking. I didn't react impulsively. Instead, I observed, analyzed, and prepared strategic responses. I knew any rash reaction could destroy the control I had maintained for weeks. During these days, I focused entirely on my own energy and emotions. I maintained my daily routines: work, exercise, meals, rest, and personal activities to stabilize my mind. Keeping a steady rhythm not only preserved control, but also reinforced strategic clarity, creating a foundation to handle any reaction from Emily or her environment. Another evening, I received information from a mutual friend that Emily had been talking with her mother about needing time to think things through. This was a significant signal. Her distance wasn't over, but she was still considering me. I analyzed the situation. Reacting hastily would cost me leverage. Remaining silent and observing carefully would allow me to understand her true motives and anticipate her next move. I began constructing the final scenario. If Emily returned, I would face her directly but with clear boundaries, acknowledge her autonomy but refuse repeated disruptive behavior. If she remained silent, I would maintain distance, continue observing, and protect my energy. If her mother intervened more aggressively, I would rely on collected observations to respond strategically, preserving control without letting emotion dictate my actions. Throughout this process, I realized a crucial truth. The real climax wasn't in Emily's words or direct actions, but in how I managed the entire situation. Maintaining calm, observing meticulously, analyzing data, and executing strategic planning became vital tools. Every action, however small, impacted the outcome directly. I also recognized that the social environment, mutual friends, social media, indirect commentary was creating additional pressure that could derail the strategy if left unchecked. Therefore, I had to balance keeping distance from Emily, managing external signals, and maintaining my own mental stability. That night, I sat down and consolidated all data: Emily's signals, her mother's behaviors, mutual friends' reactions, and my own internal emotions. I realized the challenge wasn't just controlling the relationship, but maintaining control over myself in a highly variable environment. Every decision, every action in this moment was decisive, not just for the relationship, but for personal energy, self-discipline, and long-term strategic sustainability. The 6th week arrived, and all variables had finally revealed themselves. Emily still hadn't reached out directly, but the indirect signals from her and her mother had created a clear picture of motives and emotional state. I knew it was time to turn all my observations, analysis, and data into decisive action. One afternoon, I received a message from Emily, not long, not dramatic, just a few lines stating that she wanted to meet to explain everything. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I read it over and over, analyzing every word, every period, every pause. This wasn't an emotional invitation. It was data, a variable I needed to handle. I planned the meeting carefully, set clear boundaries, prepare responses based on observed data, and control my own energy. On the day of the meeting, I met Emily at a quiet cafe, away from any third-party interference. She looked tired, but somewhat more straightforward than before. I listened, observing how she spoke, the movement of her eyes, her breathing, the small but telling cues. I analyzed every gesture, every pause, knowing that in this highly variable environment, even the smallest details could reveal true intentions. Emily explained her reasons for taking a step back, the pressure she felt, the need for self-reflection, and the influence of her mother. I remained silent, absorbing each piece of information and categorizing it by importance. What reflected her genuine needs? What was her mother's indirect tactics? And what were social signals to watch? I did not argue, did not display excessive emotion, and simply maintained control while considering my next moves. As the conversation progressed, I observed how she reacted to each question and each response I gave. Every slight hesitation or pause was data to assess her seriousness and willingness to cooperate in the future. I realized that the true climax didn't come from words, but from how I managed the entire process, from 2 weeks of silence, the indirect signals, to the strategic AmItheAsshole reactions. Finally, when the meeting concluded, I made my decision. Clear boundaries, maintaining distance if indirect behaviors continued, but keeping the door open for transparency and cooperation if Emily genuinely wanted to rebuild trust. Every response was based on data and long-term strategy, not driven by emotion and without blind compromise. As I left the cafe, I reflected on the entire process, from the weeks of silence, the indirect signals, to the way I analyzed and reacted. I had maintained control, protected my energy, and defined boundaries, and that was the most important outcome that night. I sat alone, consolidating all the data, reviewing how I had maintained strategy, patience, and observational skills. This relationship, whether it continued or not, had taught me a lesson about control, calmness, and handling complex situations without letting emotion take over. Every step forward was now grounded in logic, observation, and strategy. Rather than emotion or external pressure, I realized that maintaining calm and control in a high variability environment didn't just determine the outcome of the meeting, it was a long-term lesson in facing unexpected challenges in relationships and in life. Every choice, every action was carefully weighed, and that was the difference between losing control and maintaining personal power in any situation.